In this video, I'm going to talk about the effects of the glucocorticoid cortisol on target tissues within humans. Here, we see in the blood vessel that cortisol is released ultimately from the adrenal cortex into the blood. Because it is a hydrophobic molecule, most of it is bound to proteins, which are synthesized in the liver and released into the blood. There are two different proteins that bind up most of this cortisol. The first one is transcortin, also called corticosteroid binding globulin, or CBG. This molecule is very specific for cortisol. It has a high affinity for the molecule. Some cortisol, however, is bound to albumin. This molecule has less specificity for cortisol. In fact, it binds to quite a lot of different types of molecules, but it is so very abundant that it does bind up cortisol. Okay. So cortisol is released from its transport protein, both of which are synthesized in the liver. It is able to slip through the membrane of a target cell and bind to a glucocorticoid receptor. Okay, these glucocorticoid receptors are free in the cytosol, and once they interact with cortisol, they are going to serve as transcription factors here within the nucleus of whatever target cell we're seeing. Because cortisol is ultimately going to act as a transcription factor, there's a long latent period. That is, it takes about a day for the effects of cortisol to be seen, even once it has been released by the adrenal gland. And ultimately, it serves as a transcription factor for hundreds of different types of genes, and we're going to see the diversity of effects throughout this diagram. I also want to mention that this has a relatively long half-life. It lasts for about a half-life of about an hour and a half. Okay, now, cortisol is, of course, not remaining within the blood indefinitely and continuing to cause these effects indefinitely. A lot of times in the target tissues, there is an enzyme called 11-beta-HSD2 in particular that inactivates cortisol into cortisone. Now, there is another type of enzyme, 11-beta-HSD1, which can then take cortisone and reactivate into cortisol. So we see this balancing effect. We don't want too much or too long of a stress response, and so even in the target tissues, we can affect and control how much of the stress response we see. And so I just want to walk through a couple of the major effects that cortisol has on target tissues. I'm going to walk through the effects in the short term first, and then I'll come back around and talk about what happens if you are experiencing stress for a prolonged period of time. And so essentially, the stress response is increasing your reactivity, right? Increasing the availability of sugar, specifically for your brain, so you can think through things and strategize on how to survive appropriately. And so that's what a lot of this is that we see here. First of all, within the bones, osteoclast activity is increased, which ultimately breaks down collagen and proteoglycans, releasing amino acids into the blood. Similarly, within our muscles, proteases are increased, and these proteases start breaking down the actin and myosin within our myocytes, and again, release amino acids into the blood. Within our adipose tissue, we see lipolysis. Okay, so essentially breaking down lipids into glycerol and fatty acids, again, dumping them into the blood. And so all of these substrates are ultimately used by the liver, which is triggered by cortisol, to increase gluconeogenesis. And so this increases the blood sugar specifically available for the brain. Okay. On that note, cortisol actually decreases the sensitivity of insulin receptors in most of the tissues of the body. And so what we see is that even though there is a really high blood sugar, our target tissues can't actually take that sugar in. Okay, so the insulin might be released into the blood, but it is not actually detected, and therefore sugar is not taken into our tissues. Again, the brain is really what is prioritized by the stress response. Okay. On a similar note, the cortisol is going to increase the sensitivity of adrenergic receptors. So here we see an adrenergic receptor, which is bound to norepinephrine. And so as a secondary response to cortisol, to the stress response, we see that norepinephrine can stimulate even more glycogenolysis, that is, breaking down glycogen, again, to increase blood sugar, specifically for the brain. Okay, so lots of breaking down reserves of tissue, right, and these tissues over here, as well as stored within the liver, to increase your blood sugar. Okay? Now, if you are in a stressful situation, a prolonged stressful situation, your immune system is just using a lot of extra resources that are not necessary, okay, at least, not for a week of stress. So the cortisol actually suppresses what your immune system is doing. Specifically, it suppresses the release of inflammatory chemicals such as histamine. And so overall, suppressing the inflammatory response, it also increases the control of T helper cells or CD4 cells. And so these are really the cells that can activate the entire immune system. And so if we kind of suppress these guys here, everything else, right, the T cell, the cytotoxic T cells, the B cells, and therefore the antibody production, lots of inflammatory responses, all of that is simultaneously suppressed. And again, this makes sense because if you are an ancestral human and you are kicked out of your tribe, you probably don't have access to a lot of resources, a lot of food, a lot of shelter, and so you want to reserve whatever resources you have, and so you sacrifice your immunity for your brain. Okay. One other effect of cortisol I want to mention, and again, this is just a very brief, simplified summary of the system, but one additional feature or effect of cortisol is that it increases sensitivity of those same adrenergic receptors within our blood vessels. So this is within the tunica media of a blood vessel, and essentially when norepinephrine binds, it triggers vasoconstriction, which increases the blood pressure. So here we see a big wide open blood vessel, relatively low resistance to flow, and therefore low blood pressure. When vasoconstriction is triggered by norepinephrine, and of course enhanced by cortisol, this is going to decrease the diameter of the blood vessels, therefore increasing resistance and increasing the blood pressure. Okay, so all of this is what happens if you are experiencing a stressful situation for a week, maybe 2 weeks. If this situation continues for years, perhaps, there are some there are some side effects of this system. And so, for example, if increased osteoclast activity continues in the long term, this can lead to osteoporosis. Right? So osteoclast activity is outweighing osteoblast activity. Okay? If you keep on breaking down proteins within your muscles are going to waste away. Okay? So they're going to get smaller, you're going to get weaker. Over time, high levels of insulin are going to trigger lipogenesis within your fat, and specifically, fat deposition is going to occur generally around the waistline. Okay. If you continually have an increased blood sugar, right, and of course you are decreased in sensitivity to insulin, oftentimes chronic stress is associated with an increased risk of diabetes mellitus, right, or hyperglycemia. Okay. If you continue to suppress your immune system, right, therefore sacrificing this function for this function here, this leads to immunosuppression. And finally, if you are continually vasoconstricting, this can lead to hypertension and all of the other risks that are associated with hypertension. Okay. One other thing that I want to mention, there are many cortisol receptors within your brain. And so the stress response also has an effect on your limbic system, right, your ability to form memories, your motivation or reward system, right, so you might not be as excited about the things that you used to be excited about, you might not be fulfilled by those things, and a lot of emotions, particularly aggressive emotions, are enhanced by the cortisol response. The cerebral cortex, so this is your the part of your brain that induces higher order thinking, so your ability to solve problems and communicate complex topics can be impaired as well. Also things like balance and muscle memory in the cerebellum. Okay, so ultimately, your stress response is called your allostatic load. And so this is the cumulative ability to maintain this entire stress response up here through a stressful situation, through a change in your life or physiological condition. This concept is called allostasis, and so the summary of all of these effects that I've talked about can actually be assessed and expressed as the allostatic load. And so some things that we can measure to assess the allostatic load are the waist to hip ratio. Again, over time, there's more lipogenesis here, in your adipose tissue, and that increases around your waist. Your BMI in general, so your body mass index, again, making more fat or depositing more fat. Hemoglobin A1C, this is associated with diabetes mellitus. So this is the form of hemoglobin with carbohydrates attached, and the reason that happens is because blood glucose is elevated for just so long that the glucose is pretty much being bound up by everything. Cholesterol can be assessed, right? So here we see a lot of extra lipids within the blood. Also, if we are making lots of cortisol, right, cholesterol might be elevated to feed that system. Okay, we can assess triglycerides. Okay, we can of course assess cortisol levels in the first place. Okay, and a few other factors. Okay, and again, all of those are things that we can measure to assess the allostatic load, which is just a summary of all of these different effects. Once again, this has been a video on the glucocorticoid effects on target tissue, specifically cortisol, on bones, muscles, fat, the liver, as well as our immune system. Thanks for watching.